Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I've got another a bit longer video this time. I was sent an order from one of my German subscribers and told that I should watch this one. He told me not for verbatim, he said something like react to something serious or something like that. So this is Thomas Sowell on facts about Germans that we were never taught in school. So let's have a look at this.
Germans are an old people. Their language is centuries older than English, French, Spanish, or Italian. But the history of a dozen years has cast a long shadow over the thousands of years of their existence as a people. The rule of Hitler and the Nazis from 1933 to 1945 not only sealed the fate of the Germans of that generation, it has colored the way Germans have been seen since then.
I actually talked about this in the first video. That's why I said facts about Germany. I'm sick of the war. So yeah, I said the same thing. I said the German, not the nation, but German people are thousands of years old. And we only look at the last 100 years. And even out of the last 100 years, we're only talking about 20 odd years where, shit went down. So for the last 80 years, German people, German culture has been just shunned for, we can't excuse what happened during World War II and World War One, with the mustard gas and all that sort of stuff. We can't excuse that, and we should never forget about it, so that hopefully it never happens again. But look at even today, I still hear people make jokes about Germany and all that sort of stuff. Germany is one of the most progressive countries in the world. They help out a lot with most of the European countries. And the biggest thing that I don't like is, who decides this? So if you look at, if you go back 100 years before World War One, England was still a slave trading nation. The Danes, Portuguese, Spanish, for 400 years they shipped over, 13 million people from Africa all over the country. Not a word said. America still suffered from it, but so they should. And to do with World War Two, there was a couple other countries involved. Italy gets absolutely no shame put on them at all. Okay, even the Ukraine. How many mass murders and genocides were committed in Ukraine by the SS, all of them Ukrainian citizens. Japan just does get nothing, which is disgraceful. So, the Battle of Nanjing or Nanking, they killed 200,000 people with swords. We get taught a bit about Japan's history in Australia because it directly affected us. So some of the massacres that they did, they killed 30 of our nurses, they beheaded 30 nurses on a beach, and the way that they treated our soldiers in the death marches, and Hirohito got to keep control of Japan. It was actually one of his sons that ordered the massacre in Nanking. Nothing ever said about it. The Americans dropped 2 nuclear bombs on cities when the whole Japanese army wasn't even there. I think they were on an island at the time. An island. The whole Japanese army was on one island. They could have taken out the whole army, but instead they dropped it on 2 cities just so that they could do a test on the people. So yeah, I definitely agree. But I've thought this for a while. That how long does this have to go on? My father used to watch. I don't know what the cable TV is in Germany or other countries, but in Australia it's called Foxtel, and you watch the History Channel, and he used to call it the Hitler Channel because every second show was about the atrocities of Hitler. And he used to say the Jews will never ever let the Germans forget about this. And I kind of agree with that. And a lot of the Jewish echelon in movies and in TV, they will never ever let them forget. Anyway, let's keep going.
As well as the way the previous history of Germans has been seen. German intellectual figures, social traditions, and political movements in centuries past that were once seen in the context of their own times are now often seen as precursors of Nazi totalitarianism or of the Holocaust. Was all of German history leading up to Hitler? Or were the Nazi years simply a tragic aberration on a monumental scale?
America at the moment.
The collectivization of Germans in the minds of others has had major consequences in the real world, quite aside from its impact on intellectual conceptions of this people. At the end of the Second World War, millions of people of German ancestry living outside the Reich in various parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans were sent back to Germany, even though many of these families had been living where they were for centuries, and many of the individuals sent back to Germany had in fact never seen Germany. Winston Churchill protested these mass expulsions of millions of Germans on a scale grievous and undreamed of, and said, "We must banish revenge against an entire race from our minds." In order to assess the 12 fateful years of the Nazi regime and its relationship to German culture and history in general, we must first review that history and that culture. Germans, as a people, have extended well beyond the boundaries of present-day Germany, not only in Europe, but in overseas settlements in the Western Hemisphere and as...
I forgot to say that I'm an English teacher, so that I know that English is a Germanic language, and you can tell, by just looking at German, I can read German quite well, and you can work out every fifth word, and even the long words you can work out kind of what they're made up of. It's just the meaning that's hard.
As far away as Australia. The extent to which these far-flung settlements could be considered German.
And again, where I was born in Australia, in Logan Reserve, the whole area was all German families. So I went to school, there was only, when I went to primary school, there was only 35 kids in the class, and in the whole school, and 4 of them were my brothers and sisters, and the rest of the kids all had German names. They were Schmidts, they were Mockows, and Oppermans. Okay, and that was the whole community. It was all German, and about half an hour up, there's a place called Mount Tambourine, and all on top of the mountain is also all German and Polish people, but predominantly German.
And for how long depends, of course, on the extent to which German culture persisted among them and whether or not that culture was linked to the German nation-state. To assess that, we need to see, at least in outline, some of the prominent features of the culture and values historically associated with Germans. Moreover, the features of German culture stand out in sharper relief against the cultures of the surrounding peoples, such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe or the British and French to the west. Long before German societies became industrialized, Germans were skilled craftsmen in many fields. Germans were known for brewing beer in Roman times, and Germany today produces more beer than any other country in Europe. People of German ancestry have set up breweries as far away as Australia and China, the famous Tsingtao beer of China having been created by Germans there. The leading American brands of beer, Budweiser, Coors, and Miller, were likewise all created by people of German ancestry. German breweries in Buenos Aires drove English beer out of the market there.
I think you say Qingdao. It's not Tao, it's with the D, Qingdao. Yeah. I like the fact that beer in Germany's got the oldest government laws going back to the 11th century, where you were, fined if you didn't put in the exact amount of yeast and all that sort of stuff. So that's pretty cool. Most people don't like laws, but I like that one.
In the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, the only producers of beer in the early 20th century were Germans. Beer brewing Germans are not simply a stereotype. German craftsmen also pioneered in making pianos and took this skill with them to other countries. The first pianos in colonial America were built by Germans, who also led the way in building pianos in Australia, Russia, France, and England. German craftsmanship also created optical products that made such firms as Zeiss, Schneider, Rodenstock, and Voigtlander world leaders in high-quality lens production. The leading lens-making firm in the United States was founded by two German immigrants named Bausch and Lomb. Printing was another area in which Germans led the way. Gutenberg introduced printing with movable type in Europe, and centuries later,
I have to disagree with that. Chinese had printing presses long before that.
Germans set up the first printing press in the Western Hemisphere. When printing presses began to spread from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, they spread first into German enclaves in the East, because here were concentrated people who could read.
Also, there's just talking about that, I read a book. I don't know if it's exactly true, but there's evidence. Excuse me. Zheng He was one of the emperor's main explorers in the 1400s from China. He did 7 complete voyages of the Earth, and there is evidence that he visited the Vatican in 1421, and when they had the treasure galleons, like hundreds and hundreds of ships, they would carry the whole knowledge of the Chinese people, like the whole library of technology, and it's believed that the Chinese may have given that to the Italians, and then from there we ended up with the Renaissance. So, you know, Da Vinci, all of these people all of a sudden just blossomed out of everywhere. The oldest map known in Europe was drawn by a guy who never saw the sea. So there's evidence that he in some way got a book, or he got a drawing himself and he just copied it. And, you know, some of the oldest maps of the world are Chinese maps. Even the word California is Chinese. Peru is Chinese, means light rain. So they've already got a pretty much a full map of the world. Antarctica, 100 years before Christopher Columbus or any of the sailors from Europe. And even when Columbus got back and he was put on trial for embezzlement, they asked him how did he find it, and he said he had a map. So if you had a map of an unknown place, where did he get that map from?
Germans also pioneered in map making. The name America was given to the Western Hemisphere by a German map maker. Mining was another area in which Germans became renowned as far back as the 16th century. Copper mines in Britain were opened up by Germans, as were silver mines in Mexico, Spain, and Norway, in addition to the German mining communities in the Balkans already noted. German craftsmanship in metal created the first armor and swords manufactured in Mexico, as well as the renowned Kentucky rifle, which was in fact made by Germans in Pennsylvania. For thousands of years, Germans excelled in military operations. German generals held positions of high command in the Roman legions, as they would in later centuries command armies in Tsarist Russia, in South America, and in the United States from the Revolutionary War of 1776 to the 2 world wars of the 20th century, in both of which the U.S. Army was commanded by generals of German ancestry, Pershing and Eisenhower, respectively. German commanders of American military forces in the Second World War also included Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, and General Karl Spaatz, whose bombers reduced much of Germany to rubble. In both world wars, the armies of Germany inflicted far more casualties on opposing forces than the Germans sustained themselves. During the Middle Ages, the Teutonic Knights conquered Prussia, which became the heartland of German military prowess for centuries to come. German fighting men were in demand by rulers in Eastern Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, and were used by the British in their attempt to suppress the rebellious American colonies, as well as by the Americans in order to bring their citizen army up to the military standards required to fight the British. Ironically, Germans produced not only leading military men, but also leading pacifist groups, such as the Mennonites, who also spread to other countries. Whether in agriculture, industry, commerce, or the military, Germans...
There's a joke about the Mennonites. So why did the Amish girl get excommunicated to Mennonite?
Germans became known for thoroughness, organization, punctuality, and hard work, as well as for specific skills. Other countries not only welcomed German immigrants, but some actively recruited them, and in some cases subsidized their travel. not only in Eastern Europe, but also in developing nations in the Western Hemisphere and in Australia, Germans were recruited to pioneer in opening up undeveloped wilderness. Wherever Germans settled around the world, there were newspapers printed in German. In Russia, the St. Petersburger Zeitung was founded in 1727, followed in later years by the Saratov Deutsche Zeitung in the German agricultural settlements on the Volga, and the Odesser Zeitung among Germans who settled by the Black Sea. In the United States, during the immigrant era, most of the foreign language newspapers in the country were German. St. Louis had 2 daily newspapers in German as early as 1845, and out on the plains, there was an Odessa Zeitung set up by German immigrants from Russia who had kept their language and culture intact after settling in Russia for generations and then resettling in the United States. German language newspapers were published daily in 15 American cities, with such names as Die New Yorker Staatszeitung, the Cincinnati Volksblatt, the Chicago Abendpost, the Louisville Anzeiger, and the Deutsche Zeitung in New Orleans. In Brazil, there was the Santa Cruz Anzeiger, the Deutsche Zeitung, and the Brazil Post. Elsewhere in South America, there were the Argentinisches Tagblatt and the Deutsche Zeitung für Paraguay, among others. In the Australian city of Adelaide, the Australische Zeitung was still being published in the late 20th century. These German-language newspapers in countries around the world were just one indication of the persistence of German culture among people settled for generations.
So in Adelaide, or just north of Adelaide, you've got the Barossa Valley. So all of that area, all the winery was set up by German people.
Or even centuries in other countries. German settlers in Australia built houses and communities in the style that they had been used to in their homeland. A German traveler in 19th century Australia wrote of an immigrant settlement there. There are German public houses, a German drugstore, German doctors, stores, blacksmith, carpenter, school, church. In fact, everything is German. The traveler would believe himself in some little village of the old country between the Rhine and the Oder. A rural village in Argentina was described this way by a visitor in 1967. I entered the church and heard something I did not remotely.
I'm just talking about that. So the little school that I went to, we had the actual building that was built like in 1820, because that was the only building that we had. So the first school they built up was about 500 meters up the road, but it got destroyed by a flood. So they built the other one. So when I was a kid, it was 175 years old. So it must be 220 years old now. But it was an old wooden building, and underneath, where you could still see the beams, and on the beams where they were connecting were German words that were connecting. So they obviously built it in a shed and put it, set it up so that they can just connect it all at one site. So, but yeah, the symbols or the marks made to which joint goes to which joint were all German.
Remotely expect in this distant place. Traditional German hymns of Holy Week, sung in typical Volga German style in which each voice remains distinct. I looked around. Men, women, and children were in their Sunday dress. Some of the women wore scarves. Beneath them were faces like those of the country people in Germany. In front of the nave, the minister was preaching in common German to the parishioners. It was difficult to believe that I was in Latin America, that the ancestors of these people had left Germany for Russia 200 years ago. This cultural persistence among Germans around the world represented a loyalty to the particular subculture of the locality from which they had come, not a political loyalty to the German nation. Many had, in fact, immigrated before there was a German nation created in 1871. A 19th century German community in Australia was described as the recreation of a Silesian village. In the United States as well, Germans from particular localities settled together and maintained the culture of that area. Frankfort, Kentucky, was founded by Germans from Frankfurt, Germany, and Grand Island, Nebraska, by Schleswig-Holsteiners. Lomira, Wisconsin, was settled almost exclusively by Prussians from Brandenburg, while the nearby towns of Hermann and Theresa were settled by Pomeranians. Even among Germans who immigrated from Russia to the United States, those who came from the Volga settlements established their own communities in the Plain States, distinct from the communities in those states established by those Germans who came from the Black Sea settlements. Even when they resettled again in California, the Volga Germans and the Black Sea Germans settled separately, the former around Lodi and the latter around Fresno. How long and to what extent the Germans remained culturally separate varied with circumstances. Rural enclaves tended to remain culturally insular longer and more completely than was the case when Germans settled in urban communities that included people of other nationalities and cultures. Where the Germans were the numerically predominant urban group, as they were for centuries in much of Eastern Europe, they could assimilate the local population, or at least its upwardly mobile elements, to the German culture. But where the Germans were greatly outnumbered, and especially where the great majority of the German immigrants were male, then interactions among groups, including intermarriage, eroded the German culture. This was the case in much of 19th century Australia, but not in South Australia, where whole families of Germans tended to settle together, and there were as many women as men, so that these communities could maintain their separate social and cultural identities for generations. It was much the same story in Brazil, where there was very little intermarriage with members of the local population living near German agricultural communities well into the 20th century, while in cities and in some rural areas where there were more diverse populations, acculturation and assimilation became more common. Yet even living in cities with large numbers of people from other backgrounds did not automatically lead to rapid assimilation. In New York City, where 90% of the population was non-German, in the early 20th century, most people of German ancestry nevertheless married other people of German ancestry. That changed over the years, but not immediately or rapidly. This cultural cohesiveness was seldom accompanied by political cohesiveness or group identity politics. Germans were usually not very politically active in any case, and they tended to be underrepresented among career politicians. Where German political leaders arose in other countries, it was seldom as representatives of ethnic Germans in those countries. In the United States, for example, those people of German ancestry who did achieve prominence in politics, the Muhlenbergs in the 18th century, Karl Schurz and John Peter Altgeld in the 19th, and Herbert Hoover and Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 20th century, did so as representatives of the American people at large, rather than as spokesmen for ethnic German interests. There were similar patterns in other countries. In Australia, Germans tended to be underrepresented in politics, and those Germans who achieved political office were elected from constituencies where there were few Germans, as well as from constituencies where Germans were the predominant population. In Russia, the presence of Baltic Germans in high positions in the Tsarist government was of no benefit to the Volga Germans or the Black Sea Germans, in whom these German officials took no interest and whom they looked down on as peasants. In Brazil, Germans long remained politically apathetic until after the Second World War, when they began to elect more deputies. However, in places where the German minority was under sustained political attack, such as by the Latvians or the Czechs, Germans were provoked into political activity. The persistence of German culture did not, in most cases, mean making public dramatizations of a separate identity, exceptions again being in places like Czechoslovakia. More commonly, Germans maintained their culture without making a public issue of it. In the United States, such American sports icons as Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig grew up speaking German, and so did Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler.
All right, so that was really interesting. That's the sort of video that I've been wanting to see for a while. Okay, yeah, so it's even though the war is important, you know, isn't it time to forget about it? It's, you know, it happened. Move on. You know, like I said, we don't keep dragging up English slavery. You know, some of the things that the English did in Australia are horrible. You know, there's no native Tasmanian Aboriginals left because they were all shot. Okay, so it's that simple. In Australia, the First Peoples are still struggling with what happened 200 years after the arrival. You know, they've got massive problems with alcohol, and imagine that you've been on an island for 80,000 years and then 200 years ago you're introduced to rum. You know, there's some communities that still haven't accepted it. They just don't have the same DNA, and it affects them differently. But yeah, like I said, it's good to see a video that's actually, you know, a bit more honest. And yeah, so thanks for that, Net Cologne. That was a great video. If you got any more, please send them to me. If you like this video, like and subscribe. And hopefully you have a nice day, and I'll see you again. Bye bye.